There's very few academic colleagues I have that I know, I respect, and I learn from. So, no offense to those who might come from academia, but by your chuckle, I guess most of you know what I mean. And Jason is another of those, and it's really quite a pleasure. Jason has been on leave from UT all year. He's been in Washington, D.C. I'm sure he'll talk about the research he's doing for his forthcoming book on U.S.-Egypt relations. So we're really fortunate that in one of his trips back to Austin, he was willing to come and help us understand what's unfolding in front of us in Egypt, and the relevance of it, especially to those of us who are citizens of the United States and want to weigh in with our own government, so that that government might have a progressive influence for the first time. We'll skip the editorial comments in the introduction. Jason wrote a really wonderful first book. It's noted in the bulletin for those who were here, Authoritarianism in an Age of Democratization. Just to give you some context, political science, the discipline Jason comes out of, is, I find, to be a rather often narrowly focused and centrist, even often conservative discipline. And what's notable about Jason's work is that he has done research that's very well regarded in the field while bringing a critical sensibility to that work. And it's really a pleasure to have him here today. Jason Brownlee.
This is really a weekend for celebration. And this is, I mean, for me to be able to give this kind of talk, and I'll be giving several more talks this month, to give it on this sort of upbeat note coming off of Friday, February 11th, is a rare experience and the kind of experience I hope to have more of. I'm accustomed to talking about sort of the failings of the Mubarak government and U.S. complicity in them. I will have some things to say about U.S. policies and where I hope they can go. The rest of the story is completely inverted from the hegemony and oppression of basically one man and a small entourage to the self-liberation, the emancipation of 83 million. So it's really an honor, and it's a humbling experience to be able to try to put these latest events into some kind of context. I think February 11th, 2011 may go down in history as the day in which Egypt emerged and started to become the largest democracy in the region of the Middle East. You could think of it as the day it moved toward becoming the India of the Middle East, a role model of popular emancipation through nonviolent struggle, whose example will go on to inspire other countries. Just to sort of recapture the sense of what people were experiencing on Friday, I was watching on Al Jazeera English and Arabic, and speaking with Egyptian friends, and there was just unfettered elation in the streets of Cairo and around Egypt. Maybe for Americans who are not used to, none of us are used to witnessing revolutions like this, but for pop culture fans, there's already been a video put online weaving together scenes from Tahrir Square on Friday with the finale scene from Return of the Jedi, where they're celebrating the destruction of the Death Star and the death of, killing Darth Vader and ending the Empire. So that's, if that's what helps Americans connect, then, more power to them, I suppose. And then for a generation of young Americans who came out even after the original Star Wars movies, this is really the first revolution that they've witnessed, that they've been able to follow through TV. If you think about people who were born, in the 80s and don't remember 89, or were born subsequently, this is really a defining moment for them. So, what had been accomplished exactly? What's the big deal about this revolution? So on the 18th day of continuous, unprecedented daily protests across Egypt, in which millions of Egyptians took part, Hosni Mubarak, who'd been ruling since 1981, finally acceded to the core demands of the Egyptian people that he resign from office and that he opened the way for real political reforms in a system that had been authoritarian and repressive for nearly 6 decades. The January 25th movement, that's the day that this whole thing began, that movement brought together grassroots activists, labor and professional unions, and members of kind of traditional political parties, traditional opposition parties, and then just many, many more Egyptians who were previously politically inactive. And it brought them together in a contentious experience of contentious collective action that challenged a regime that many specialists, including me, thought was just totally resilient and durable and essentially invulnerable over the short term. And the first 2 weeks of demonstrations, actually, well, even really right up through day 17, they reminded us just how stubborn and entrenched Mubarak had become. But even despite that position on Mubarak's side, the demonstrators prevailed. And in the few moments on Friday, when Vice President Omar Suleiman announced Mubarak's resignation, Egypt flipped from being a testament of durable authoritarianism into a symbol of popular sovereignty. And it's hard to overstate the heroism on the part of the Egyptian people that was required to oust the 82-year-old president. Many lost their lives. The Human Rights Watch estimates that 300 died in clashes instigated by Mubarak's police, plainclothes police, and also thugs that Mubarak had hired. And although the economy had been failing for a long time, and that was a big part of what brought Egyptians out to protest Mubarak, there's no guarantee that a collapsing economy will produce a democratic revolution. I mean, you can think about Zimbabwe, you can think about other cases around the world where there's a ruler in charge who's repressing his people, not managing the economy well, but things just keep declining. And so what's amazing about Friday is this turnaround and this opening and this hope for a new direction. So the demonstrators defied very long odds, they persevered, and they created what I think will be a lodestone for opposition movements around Africa and Asia. If Mubarak can be overthrown by indigenous, peaceful opposition, any autocrat can. Okay, but here's a puzzling thing, and I'm about to talk about U.S. foreign policy, and I'll preface that by saying, when I spoke with one of my good Egyptian friends in Washington on Friday by phone, because I had gotten to Austin, and I started bringing up the U.S., he said, no talk about the U.S. This is just for us today. Let's just celebrate. He's like, we'll get back to that next week. But already on it's a big part of the discussion in Egypt. I was watching one of the most popular satellite evening talk show programs yesterday, and the host, her name's Mona Shazli, was speaking with a very famous Egyptian historian, and one of her first questions was, why was the U.S. is the U.S. uneasy about this? Is the U.S. kind of anxious? So it's on people's minds. And so here's the puzzling thing for me. At this moment in which the public in Egypt was triumphing, and in the face of Egypt's peaceful democratic revolution, the U.S. government reacted with hesitation, ambivalence, and fear. And Washington, and as Bob mentioned, I've been living in Washington a fair bit this year. Washington, including the White House, State Department, Pentagon, Capitol Hill, is anxious. And in some cases, it's like you could take the strongest leftist critique of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and now hear it being uttered by Democrats and Republicans as the pretext for trepidation and justifying prolonging the status quo as much as possible. And I would say there are three components to this sort of critique that has turned into a kind of defense or apology. The first is U.S. interests should be guaranteed before local democracy is allowed. Now, if you heard, we heard Noam Chomsky say that all the time. Yeah, that's just the way things work. They make sure that interests are guaranteed before people can take control of their own countries. But now it's being voiced by Republicans on Capitol Hill, members of the Obama administration, like, well, let's not get too excited about this. Let's not romanticize what's happening. We've got to make sure that our interests are guaranteed. The second thing that I think leftist analysts would have brought up for years, and that is now coming from op-ed columnists and politicians, is there's something scary about Muslims and something especially scary about overtly Islamic movements, and they probably shouldn't be allowed to participate equally in politics alongside other trends. Now, this is not a general critique about religion and politics. It's okay to have very traditional Christian movements involved in politics. It's specifically something about Islam that tends to concern the people. And so invariably, when I'm doing a media interview, the question of the Society of Muslim Brothers and what their role will be in Egypt comes up, as if, again, there has to be some sort of guarantee for U.S. interests before Egyptians are allowed to pick the kind of government they want. And then the third kind of plank of this position is that there are certain countries in the Middle East, very close U.S. allies like Israel, whose concerns about living in peace and security matter more, they're not just on an equal basis but actually matter more than the needs of 83 million Egyptians and 200 million other people in the Middle East to live free of violence as well. So a sort of inegalitarian sense of the needs of all people of the Middle East to have personal security and live freely. I'm just going to say a couple more things about this moment and then give you some background and then return to the moment. So, and here I continue to kind of engage the Washington discourse. The revolution in Egypt was done by Egyptians, for Egyptians, and outside governments don't need to be giving the people in Tahrir Square any instructions about how to start a democracy. On the contrary, they should be taking notes about what organic democracy and organizing looks like. Another sort of question that keeps coming up is, well, don't they need more leadership? Who are the key sort of interlocutors for the U.S.? And one of the amazing things about the January 25th movement is that it was decentralized, that they didn't actually have individual leaders that the government could try to co-opt or try to pick off, but instead it was really, it had this element of spontaneity, this element of sort of collective participation, and that's really been a powerful aspect of it. So while recognizing, though, that the U.S. government should not be instructing people in Tahrir who participated in the demonstrations, there is a role Americans can play in challenging the prejudices and the assumptions that portray Egyptian democracy as something we should be afraid of. And while challenging those taken for granted notions, we can begin to shift, because I don't think this shift has really happened yet, we can begin to shift official U.S. support from the Egyptian military and the security services, and the Obama administration and Congress are really entwined in those, and I can speak more about that later, begin to shift support from the Egyptian military to the Egyptian people. And although Mubarak is out of office, he leaves behind a security apparatus that the U.S. government has supplied and trained since the late 1970s, and which I think poses the ultimate obstacle before civilian sovereignty in the long run. So this is kind of where I'm coming from as I try to process the events of the past 48 hours and 20 days, and I'm looking forward to a discussion after I complete the rest of my remarks. The other thing I want to sort of talk about before we get to discussion is just to kind of flesh out the timeline that is provided in the handout Bob distributed, how Egypt got here, what role the U.S. has played. And the basic takeaway from the history I'm going to review is that, contrary to claims by the White House that the U.S. has no leverage or that this is a process for Egyptians to make on their own, the U.S. has been a constitutive force. I mean, it has helped to constitute, helped to build up the regime that Egyptians have begun dismantling.